Game over, man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger boat. So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for September 24th, 2024, and I'm Jaden Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody, for this conversation as we talk about Brendan's three daughters.
Oh, that's news to me. Wow.
That
This feels like an episode of Maury. Brendan, you are the father.
you are the father. Did you know that? You had
Three
of
times
them.
over, apparently. I mean, hey, my wife Maris and I, we're at a point where we're talking about hoping to have kids at some point, and I do want to be a girl dad. So, if anything, you're just kind of, alluding to something that I do hope for someday.
Yeah.
So, if anything, well, maybe this is.
It might come true. Maybe this is foreshadowing. Who knows?
Maybe it is. Yeah.
Yeah. I would love for you to have girls because I, of course, have two boys and we need some more femininity in the In Session Film family.
Some more estrogen up in here.
Yes. So hopefully you have some wonderful daughters. I look forward to meeting them one day. Until then, we'll talk about his three daughters instead.
Yeah, not my three daughters, his three daughters.
His three daughters. Yes, this is the latest film from Azazel Jacobs, starring Carrie Coon, Natasha Lyonne, and Elizabeth Olsen. This is also a film that I have been kind of looking forward to because it premiered at TIFF last year, but it did not come out in 2024, although I think it did get a select release, like a very limited 2024 release, if I'm not mistaken. But its streaming debut, its real debut, I would consider, is obviously in 2024. It just came out on Netflix last weekend, I believe. Last Friday,
Yes.
It came out on Netflix.
Yep.
But I had heard really good things about this when it premiered at TIFF. And I read the synopsis. It looked like it was something right up my alley.
I was going to say,
This
just the
cast
plot synopsis here is very much a JD movie.
It is very much a JD movie, and it has a great triple header in terms of this cast, these three sisters, these three daughters, if you will.
Yeah.
And I was like, man, I am very much looking forward to this movie. So it has very much been on my radar since January, and I've been counting to the days to see it. So I am very, very anxious to get into the movie. So without further ado, shall we get into it, Brendan?
Shall we talk about his three daughters?
Let's do it. All right. It is written and directed by Azazel Jacobs. As I noted, it stars Carrie Coon, Natasha Lyonne, Elizabeth Olsen, and a few others that come and go throughout the film, but it primarily is those three actresses.
Yeah.
If you're not familiar with his three daughters, it is a tense, touching, and funny portrait of family dynamics as it follows three estranged sisters as they converge in a New York apartment to take care for their ailing father and try to mend their broken relationships with one another. All right, Brendan, let's jump into it. What did you think about his three daughters?
Yeah, there's a lot more to it than just that plot synopsis because, yes, these three sisters are estranged in their own way, but for some of them, they're also half-sisters. We may talk a little bit more about kind of the family tree of all of this as this conversation goes. It slowly reveals itself as the movie progresses. There is one other actor I want to highlight that's here for one, maybe two scenes, and that's Jovan Adepo.
Yep. I want to talk about him as well.
Yeah, he has a really good scene, but I want to highlight him because you may have seen him in films like Damien Chazelle's Babylon, but most specifically, I remember first seeing him in Fences, the Denzel Washington film, which many people may recall was also based on a stage play where both Denzel and Viola Davis played those respective parts on the stage, and then he directed himself and her once again for those parts in the film adaptation. I bring this up because when we talked about Fences, we talked about how it's a film that we ultimately liked, but it couldn't really shake the staginess of it. It just didn't quite have the level of it didn't quite have the same cinematic language that we would want from a movie that's still very isolated and in one location.
Mhm.
And ironically, His Three Daughters, from what I understand, is not based on a stage play, but it very much feels like one. I was very much
Sure.
reminded of Fences while watching this, and
Yeah.
I don't think the film here, His Three Daughters specifically, always gets away with that staginess. At times, it did make me feel like I would have rather seen this on the stage. There are moments where I feel like, okay, I just wish the cinematic language here was a bit more, well, cinematic. I wish it was playing with some of these things a little bit more. But the performances here from these three women are very electrifying that at times it almost doesn't matter. I do think their dynamic is very compelling, and that is ultimately where the film is at its strongest. And they all have very different personalities and very different relationships with not just each other, but also their father. And that gradually reveals itself throughout the film, which I did find compelling. And it does lead to a very cathartic conclusion that did work for me. So I didn't always love the staginess of it, but I think underneath is an emotional core that mostly works. I think it works best as a performative piece and as a piece of script writing. Not always a piece of directing, but everything else that needs to work for it, I think mostly does work. So yeah, I like the film overall.
Yeah, I really liked it a lot as well. I do agree with you. It is a little stagey at times, but once the film gets beyond its initial introductions, I do think it becomes a very compelling examination of grief and how this lingering inevitability starts to break down all three of our central characters. I love the complexity and all of that because it's raw and completely unfiltered. Their dad is on his deathbed, and there's a vulnerability that comes with that. You're on edge knowing that the worst is about to come, but you don't know exactly when. And how do you cope with that? That foundation is what gives way to the performances of this film. And ultimately, that's where it thrives. Carrie Coon, Elizabeth Olsen, Natasha Lyonne, as we noted, all of them are terrific in their own ways. Olsen, I do think, is slightly uneven in those early scenes, but by the end, I think she
Yeah,
wonderfully leans into being the glue for the three sisters.
there's a
And she gives
volatility in her.
credence.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Carrie Coon gives such a commanding performance that is often stern and unyielding. Katie has this rigorous outer shell that is very hard for her sisters to penetrate. And boy, does Coon wonderfully tap into that in her performance. However, Leone gives the best performance here for my
She's the
money.
standout. I think she's the
I,
standout. Yeah.
I do think it's a slightly trickier performance in that she initially comes off as non-confrontational and distant from her sisters. She's often smoking weed, making bets on sports, and is high throughout this entire film. But eventually, she finds her way into the conversation. And when she does, there's this tender expressiveness in Leon's performance that quietly gutted me.
Yeah.
That was my dad too. Is so poignant.
That's a
and
great
heartfelt.
line.
That is the line of the film for me. Or I think about the moment when she, for the first time in the film, walks into her father's room and just tells him about this parlay that she had just bet. There's
And
something
we still don't
so
see
moving
him.
and
He's
innocent.
still
We don't
in
see
the
him.
background. Yeah.
Absolutely. I love that moment. To me, there's just more exquisite layers to her performance, even though I do think all three are great, but Leone is very much the MVP for me here. On the whole, very good film, one that illustrates beautifully the raw complexities that can surface when dealing with death. And I do think in that the film is able to overcome its overall staginess that can be a little apparent at times.
Yeah, at first, there's that one opening scene where they're all just sitting in a circle in chairs being visited by hospice. It was maybe 5 or 10 minutes in where I thought, ooh, I think I'm going to struggle with this. The staginess was just suffocating the entire experience. And
Okay.
it does
Yeah.
get to a point maybe halfway through where either I got used to it or it's able to break away from just a single room into a single apartment, and it almost feels like each room is its own set piece then. So it is able to, cinematically speaking, it is able to expand and feel like it does turn more into a movie by that point. And as we're talking about, the performances here they're commanding enough that it gets to a point where you kind of forget about that. I do think Natasha Lyonne is the highlight. I do agree with you there. And she's the half sister that I alluded to earlier. She's definitely the most quote unquote estranged of the three. And where I
Yeah.
think the film is at its most effective thematically, it's not just the things you're talking about there as far as how we deal with grief, the idea of what it means for someone to want to die peacefully. That's a conversation that's also talked about here. But
Yep.
I think we've all dealt with similar ideas of familial misunderstanding. It's easy to judge people just because you think they're different, you think they come from a different place, you think they're lazy, you think there's more of a story there, and ultimately, it's not too different from when we just simply have to sit back and listen to what their stories are. That distance between, particularly, it's Rachel, who's played by Natasha Lyonne. Rachel and Katie, I think their dynamic is really the arc of the movie, the thematic arc specifically. They're coming together and their realizations that they have their own individual relationships to their father. That doesn't make them bad people or bad caretakers. And the idea of familial misunderstanding, excuse me, I think is probably the most powerful thing that I took away from it.
Yeah, I think what's so fascinating about this film is that as you're talking about the three sisters here are estranged. We do come to understand that there's vivid conflict between Katie and Rachel, specifically, as you're noting there. Katie, again, because of this harder outer shell that she embodies, she simply isn't willing to put up with the personality that Rachel gives off.
Yeah.
And because of that, it does lead to some fascinating banter between the two of them.
She's very
that-
judgmental. She opens up the fridge and sees, oh, there's only apples in here. This is all Rachel has been keeping in
Yeah.
here to feed our father. When it turns out that's what he wanted. That's what he
Yeah.
liked. So,
she was
yeah.
very myopic in that regard as well. And I love how the film is willing to subvert these characters in that regard, because even as an outsider, as the audience, rather, we somewhat understand why Katie would feel that way when you simply open a fridge and all there are these apples in the fridge. And the film had established that Rachel doesn't carry a conventional responsibility in that she has a 40-hour-a-week job. She doesn't have kids. She's not married, as Katie is. So you might immediately posit her through some sort of stereotypical lens that the film slowly but surely peels apart those layers to reveal that she's actually maybe the most responsible of all three of the sisters, and that Katie was very myopic in her judgment of Rachel there. I love the natural rhythms within the dialogue there. To me, that's where the strengths of this film lie. And that's, again, why I can overcome the staginess of the film, because the dialogue is so assiduous and natural, and how these revelations come about throughout the film. I never found it manufactured. I don't think it's manipulating the audience emotions or even the characters' emotions. I think there's a lot of care put into who these characters are, why they react the way they do. There's so much that makes sense to the choices they make, to what they say to each other. However, what I really love about this film as well is that while we do come to understand them and the fears, the trepidation they're experiencing because their father is about to pass over, there's also a little ambiguity to it. Like there is a sense of mystery as to why these characters have arrived to where they are. Like, the film gives us clues, but I don't think it overly indulges in that. For example, why is Katie as hardened as she is? We know that she has a daughter that she is in some conflict with. There's the conflict she has with Rachel, but I don't know if that's enough to fully articulate why she's so hardened in her ways, why she's so rigid as a character. Like there's more to the character that would explain that the film doesn't get bogged down in explaining.
No.
And I
Yeah.
kind of love that it finds that balance.
Well, you find yourself thinking about that and maybe creating your own backstory for the character because of how
Yeah.
good Carrie Coon is. And we've talked about this a
Yeah.
lot. Sometimes
Yes.
a great performance fills in those gaps in the screenplay. A lesser
Exactly.
performance would have turned Katie into a severely underdeveloped character. But Carrie Coon overcomes that. That's what makes it a great performance. That's what makes
Mhm.
Rachel a great character as well. Natasha Lyonne's performance, I think, does more or less a lot of similar things, especially given I'd say her history is probably the most I guess defined as far as the script writing here. We definitely get the most sense of her relationship with their father and the fact that he's actually not her blood father. She only calls him daddy because
That's the
that's
best
how she
moment
was
of the
raised.
film.
That's the
Like,
best moment
yeah.
of the film, though. But
Yeah.
she's probably the one that has the most literal backstory. But even so, it's not a fully defined backstory. Her performance is still able to fill in those gaps. Maybe it
And
is.
I still think we have to infer. Sorry to
Yeah, you're right.
cut
You're right.
in, because I think what's interesting about that revelation, you're right that we do learn more about Rachel. She's been taking care of their father in this apartment, and we
Mhm.
find out that he's not her blood father. I
Yeah.
love that moment, how she fights for that idea. He was the one that took care of me because her
Yeah.
father died when she was 4, but her dad is the one in the room dying. That's the one that took care of her. So there is
Mhm.
something about what defines family that the film argues for, but doesn't. It's not a thematic idea that this film hits you over the head with. I do love how
No.
that is handled here.
Mhm.
However, again, to that sense of mystery, though, I think there's more to the character that we can infer simply based off of how we come to understand Rachel and her quirks and her ticks, and
Mhm.
like, why doesn't she have a job? Like, the film doesn't fully explain that, but there's enough of, well, she's taking care of her father, and there's all these external factors that we can kind of put the pieces together without the film spoon feeding that to us, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Their relationship, Rachel and Katie, really is the nucleus of the entire film in a way, which
Mhm.
is maybe where I still have some question marks on why Christina is even here in the first place, Elizabeth Olsen's character. And
Well, I think
I,
she's the glue. Like, I think
well,
she's kind of the
she's
middle
kind of
ground.
she's
I
the
guess.
she's the mediator in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. Um I don't want to call her performance the weak link here because I think it's a good performance. It might just be one of those cases where the other two performances are so good it maybe heightens some of the other imperfections of the third person in a way, just by as like a
A little bit of
byproduct of
that.
sorts.
Yeah.
I mean, Christina's very volatile. It's clearly established that she likes to talk about her family life and her kids and her husband and the perfect life she has at home in a way that seems to suggest it might not be so perfect. I mean, that's basically her arc in a way.
Yeah.
And Elizabeth Olsen does sell that. Um, I wonder if she sells it a little bit too hard at times. And maybe that's just given the comparison we have to Katie and Rachel's dynamic that I found it so different and so disconnected from the other two. And I don't know if I mean that as a criticism or not.
Mhm.
It's just a very different performance, especially from Elizabeth Olsen. I don't
Yeah.
know if I've ever really seen her give a more volatile performance like this one. So it's very much a new experience for someone like myself, and being a fan of hers and seeing her channel different things. But I do wonder about that. It's a very interesting performance nonetheless.
It is an interesting performance. I also have questions about it. One of the biggest for me is around this aspect of the character that is established early on that I do find a bit strange, and maybe ironically, because there are a few moments where characters articulate that Christina is a bit odd and strange. That's how
Yeah.
they phrase it. And I didn't really sense that at all. There's some disconnect between the writing and Olsen's performance that isn't able to
Well,
articulate Christina
I
as this weird, strange character, at least not any more so than her sisters. I
well,
didn't find her to be an outlier in that
Yeah,
regard.
I will defend that a little bit because I think that's more so heightening Katie's more judgmental and myopic attitudes.
Well, that
Prim
the first time we hear it is from Rachel,
well, that
and
also could be well, that's also heightening the disconnect between all of them because I can't tell you how
maybe
many times, and this is not me specifically, but I've had conversations with people where they might say, "Oh, that person listened to the Grateful Dead. They're weird. I don't like them." So it's they'll say things like that before they even get a chance to know
yeah.
them. So if
Well,
anything, it's
and
heightening the myopic nature of the three of
yeah.
them.
And maybe that circles back to what I was saying earlier in that there is a sense of mystery with these characters that the
Yeah.
film doesn't really get into.
Yeah.
And maybe that's it. We do find out that she used to be a Grateful Dead fan,
Mhm.
and maybe she still is secretly. I don't really know.
Mhm.
However, the way she acts at the beginning of this film, I don't think is all that strange. She talks about
I agree.
her daughter and her family life. That is something that she is proud of. You're right. That becomes a talking point throughout the film because Katie and Rachel feel as if she's projecting some sort of superficial, I have everything put together kind of thing when
Mhm.
that simply isn't Christina's intent as much as it is. She's proud to
Mhm.
have this daughter that she really loves. I mean, as the night we are recording this, right before we got on this call, I put a video up
I saw your
on my
Facebook thing.
Facebook
Yeah, I think Andrew running around like a
of
maniac.
Andrew running right at me and tackling me. Like, I do that as well. Like, and I'm not trying to project that everything's perfect with me and my life and everything that's happening at home. That is certainly
Yeah.
not the case, but
Yeah.
you love your kids and you're proud of them and you want to talk
But
about them.
I think what the movie's aware of, and sorry to cut you off if you had more to say about that, because it's
Mhm.
very personal to you, and I know how much you love Andrew. But I think the movie is suggesting that those that feel the need to target or judge people that do those things as if they have some type of hidden, I guess, sadness that they're not willing to talk about. That says more about the people doing the judging than those receiving the judging.
Perhaps.
And I think
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
maybe what's going on here.
And that certainly could be the nucleus of some of those comments.
Mhm.
But what's weird about it in the context of this film specifically is that when Rachel confronts Christina on the bench and says, "You're such a weird person," we hadn't seen that. Their history might suggest that. Again, going to the sense of mystery of these characters, because obviously we don't really know. We're only catching up with them right now as they're all three at this house taking care of their dad. That's really
Mhm.
all we have known about them at that point in the film. So where that comes from, I don't know. And I mean, even as the film goes, I don't find Christina to be this weird character. There's certainly nuances and texture to the character.
Yeah.
And
She could be
these
a
other
little
ways
heightened
as we're
at
talking
times,
about.
but yeah.
But that was really the biggest question I have surrounding Olsen's performance, because it seems as if the writing in the film was tapping into the character being a bit eccentric and maybe being a little strange in relation to now being a mother as well that is proud of her daughter, that
Mhm.
Olsen isn't able to articulate in her
It's
performance. Like that to me is why
well, it's
I
almost like it's trying
question
to
the
do both.
performance.
Yeah, it's almost like it's trying to do both. It's trying to be a performance that suggests, excuse me, that there is a myopic viewpoint from her sisters that, oh, they see her as weird, but she actually isn't. And then she's giving a performance that seems to suggest actually maybe she is a little bit weird. So it's like it's kind of
Yeah,
doing both, it seems like. So maybe the lack
I'm
of a
not
middle
sure.
ground is probably the biggest problem with that performance and why sometimes it seems maybe a
Yeah,
little bit too heightened and then not heightened enough simultaneously.
yeah.
So maybe that's kind of the thing.
The only time I feel like the film comes close to bridging that gap is this moment where Christina and Katie have a brief exchange in the kitchen,
Mhm.
and we see Christina not go into her room or her father's room. She comes around the corner and sits on a chair in the living room area, and
Yeah.
Katie goes to her room to find her to ask her some sort of question. But the
Yeah.
camera isn't really on Katie. We just hear her kind of off in the distance. It's a single stationary shot.
That's a good
It
shot.
slightly
That's the
pans
utilization of
behind the
station. Yeah,
wall
that's
to
really
the
good cinematic.
hallway. Exactly. Now, why Christina doesn't go to her room, why she doesn't go to her father's room, why she sits on that chair and just kind of stoically looks off into the distance, that was admittedly a bit odd. Like that to me was the first moment I was like, that is a little bit of a weird move. I'm just going to walk stoically by myself into this area and I'm just going to sit down and stare off into the distance. To me, there was a little bit of a weirdness there. I was like, well, maybe that's what the film was aiming for earlier that I don't think it quite got to in those early scenes. And, because Katie comes around the corner and she is a bit caught off guard. Like, what are you doing? Like, why are you just sitting here quietly in this open area? And she's like, I just needed a moment. Okay, fair enough. So, and again, like given the context of the circumstance, that is an understandable decision, but like in execution, it was kind of a weird move by Christina. And so maybe that was the film trying to bridge that gap a little bit.
Yeah, if there was if there were more moments like that, maybe it could have gotten away with it. Maybe it's just not enough to really justify that balance between normal and eccentricities that exist in Christina. So I don't know. But needless to say, I love Rachel's reaction to it. She has a deep-rooted concern that we haven't really seen from her at that point yet. So it's almost like a cryptic turning point for the Rachel character, which I do think ultimately works.
Yeah. Yeah, I think also, slightly moving away from Christina, what I really love about this film as well, and some of the conflict that comes about, is what this film has to say about, again, the inevitability that death is knocking and these three sisters having to cope with that reality and the uncertainty of the when and how. And there's a couple of times throughout the film where they have these close calls, and seeing them react to that is quite riveting. And at the end of the film, there's some incredible questions provoked around how situations like this give us this path to think about ourselves, how our parents might perceive us. Like there's this introspective period where we get to look back, say goodbye, and think about how our parents viewed us, how that might have created a sense of identity, and just the idea of that introspection come about because of the loss, like how that leads to us, viewing ourselves, viewing the world around us in a way that we might not have thought about otherwise. And I think that's where a lot of the conflict of this film comes about, because these three characters are forced to confront that. They have no choice but to confront that with themselves and with each other. And when there's nowhere else to go, when you're kind of contained in the small space, sometimes things bubble up. But I do love how the film it kind of wrestles with all of that here.
And crystallizes in a way of just simply suggesting the need for love and companionship among family members in a way that's not subtle at all. The ending to this film is anything but subtle, and yet still kind of moving. And I don't want to give too much away, but it does turn into a very kind of direct fantasy for a brief moment. And it's not hiding that. It's sort of tricking you at first, but then there's a revelation that suggests, oh, this, as you expected, was somewhat fabricated in a way. But the messaging is very on the nose, but still very poignantly delivered, primarily due to a very particular performance I don't want to name, just given the nature of how a certain character is always left in the shadows. But I think the revelation of that character, and it's not like a revelation as to who plays this character. That's not the revelation. It's just the fact that we're finally seeing this person, and the jolt of action that occurs is kind of harrowing, kind of moving, as I said. But it's not subtle in the messaging it's meant to deliver, but you still feel it.
I agree. And I think what I really love about that, honestly, it tethers impeccably to what I was just talking about in terms of how this circumstance and dealing with death and grief and this sense of loss that we're experiencing, how that forces us to grapple with how we see ourselves, how we
Yeah.
view our relationships with our parents or those that we're losing. And that is manifested, as you're talking about, in a very literal way at
Mhm.
the end of this film through this act of, I don't know, magical realism, if that's what you want to call it. There's certainly
I
like,
guess. I mean, from what I understand, there are stories of things like that actually happening. Like you get that one final jolt of energy as if everything's okay, but that's really your body's recognition that okay, we have this one final moment to let everything out before we actually die.
yeah,
Like I think there are instances of that happening, but it
yeah,
does
it could be
feel
literal. Yeah,
but even so,
yeah,
the way it's framed here, the way it's performed, does have this kind of, like you said, magical realism to it. This almost ghostly aura to it, and it's certainly going for that. I think.
yeah. I completely agree. But I think what I love about it is that aside from it being this goodbye, it's like I kind of interpreted the moment as these three characters wrestling with who they wanted to be in the eyes of their father or what that
Hmm.
relationship was. And it's something that they're forced to wrestle with. Like in their day to day, it's probably something they would have never have thought
Yeah.
about, or and it's something many of us probably don't think about. But when
Hmm.
our parents are in that circumstance on their deathbed, you're gonna think about that relationship in a sharp, vivid way that you don't like in a way you'll never have otherwise, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And the sense of feeling that is going to come about there, I think,
Yeah.
is it's incredible to how this film kind of evokes that, I guess,
And
is what
that
I'm
it
trying to
adds
say.
to the tension of the film. That's where it becomes at its
Yeah,
most thrilling from a literal standpoint.
yeah, absolutely. And again, just to see how death brings these characters together in a way, again, nothing revolutionary about that here, but in the
Hmm.
context of these three estranged sisters and seeing how eventually they're able to overcome some of that conflict and grapple with this inevitable death that's about to
Yeah,
happen.
it's
I love the execution of seeing them kind of bond over that, I
and
guess.
there's still some ambiguity by the end. There is a
Yeah,
reconciliation by the end here, but it's hard to determine if that reconciliation is fully solidified by the time the end credits start rolling. Like we
sure.
don't know if that volatility will creep its way back into their lives, maybe in a few
Could.
months or a
Yeah.
few years. It doesn't feel fully conclusive, which I liked. I don't think
Well,
like it's hard for family members to sometimes maintain that type of closeness in these kind of times.
yeah.
So I appreciate the film actually tapping into that notion.
Well, I think what's fascinating about that and what you're saying, because there is a moment in this film where Katie confronts Rachel, and this is after she's apologized, recognizing her myopic behavior,
Hmm.
and that Rachel, was way more responsible than she was giving her credit for.
Right.
So she apologizes and she says something about how after all of this, she still wants to maintain a relationship, even
Hmm.
though their father was the only thing that truly connected them together because they had different
Yeah.
mothers and
Yeah.
both of their mothers have already passed. That there technically isn't a reason to connect them together
Yeah.
aside from them wanting to maintain that relationship, something that Katie speaks to, and Rachel eventually succumbs to that as well, and Christina, of course, being a big part of that. But to your point, if Christina, who lives across the country, continues to live her life separately from Katie and Rachel, Katie living in Brooklyn, if she continues to be separated and by staying in Brooklyn and never coming to visit Rachel, what if this moment in time and the way they bond here is specific to just this moment in time? Maybe that's
Yeah.
something that death does, like that's the role death has in our lives. is that it brings everyone together for a specific purpose where we can reflect on our lives, the memories, how we view ourselves with each other. And it's just this specific thing that happens at that time. And afterwards, you do go back to being in your isolated bubbles.
Yeah.
Maybe that
Yeah.
is
I think that's
what the
entirely
film is
possible.
also might be hinting at. I don't know.
Yeah, so there is a sweetness to this movie, but there's also like something kind of cynical about it too. Especially by the end, it definitely is having it both ways, and I think it mostly gets away with it by the end.
Should we talk about Benji? You want to talk about that moment in this film? I know we mentioned Depo earlier, but
Yeah, we mentioned him earlier mostly to make the fences comparison. So in a way, I
yes,
brought him up earlier to, I guess, criticize the movie. When in actuality, he probably gives my second favorite performance here, just
he's
behind
really
Natasha
good.
Lyonne.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I really liked him a lot as well. That moment where he confronts specifically Katie. Christina
yeah.
is in the scene, but it's Katie
Yeah,
that
she's
he mostly
stuck in
has
the
a
middle of the
problem with.
confrontation, but it's really against Katie. Yeah.
It really is. And the way he barks back at Katie, it is extremely gratifying. It's such a
Yeah.
fun moment in this film.
Yeah. Yeah. It's weird. It's not even weirdly, it's very cathartic. And
Yeah.
I like the film did a pretty good job playing with suspense and uncertainty, especially with regard to Rachel's caretaking for Vincent, their father.
Yeah.
There's a lot of uncertainty as to whether she really was caring for him properly or if she was ultimately being lazy, if Katie's accusations were right. But
Mhm.
there's something about Benji's confrontational attitude that really starts to add more layers and confusion as to, oh, maybe Rachel was actually there for Vincent. Maybe she was doing a good job because there is something
Yeah.
so convincing from regarding his point of view, whether it's something he really believes, but it does feel like it comes from a place of earnestness, from a place of
Yeah.
seriousness, not from a place of selfishness. So it
Yeah.
adds another layer to this whole dynamic, and in many ways is
Yeah.
kind of a turning point for the film.
It really is. And I think what's so beautiful about it is that Rachel essentially begs him not to confront
Hmm.
Katie about it. She wants to be non confrontational,
Yeah.
even though it is her house. Her name is on the lease. She's
Hmm.
been taking care of her father, where Katie and Christina have been absent. It's just been
Yeah.
Rachel and Benji taking care of their father, doing the dirty work.
Yeah.
And now come Katie and Christina barging into their lives and taking over the apartment.
Yeah.
And you can understand why Rachel would feel a little
Invaded.
disrespected or belittled in the moment.
Yeah, and I think it's
And
even
so,
Benji that was it Benji the one that even reveals when I say reveals, it's us as the audience hearing for the first time
yeah,
that Katie actually lives in Brooklyn. She's
yeah,
basically right
yeah,
down the road in many
not
ways.
terribly far away. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. So
eh,
why? And apparently she only comes like once a year. So like all of a
yeah,
sudden, like there's new nuances coming to light that
yeah.
Katie's got some imperfections now.
Well, and that's the thing. When we learn about these things, it's like we want Rachel. We also, as the audience, want Rachel to stand up for herself.
Right.
You've been doing the dirty work. You've been the one taking care of him. Don't let Katie walk over you. But that's just not her personality. She'd rather get high and sit outside
Hmm.
on the park bench and stare at the sunset. That's her personality.
Yeah.
But Benji realizes that if that she's not that Rachel's not going to do it, so he's going to take the initiative. So he takes a moment where he barks back at Katie, and it
Yeah.
is admittedly quite cathartic, as you're talking about. And one of my favorite moments of the film from a filmmaking standpoint, there's this brilliant edit where in the aftermath of Benji and Katie having their little skerfuffle there's a brief edit to Rachel and Benji simply hugging each other in the like right outside the elevator of the apartment.
Yeah.
And it's such a tender, beautiful moment where Rachel, even though it's not like she wanted that to happen because she did ask Benji not to, but
Hmm.
you did sense her gratefulness there
Yeah.
with Benji, that he did something that maybe she deeply wanted to do, but just didn't have the conviction.
But she knew
to.
it, but then she realized it came from a place of genuine love.
It came from love,
Yeah.
a place of love. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's something about that embrace that sparks something new in Rachel that then comes forward throughout the rest of the film. It's such a brief little edit. It doesn't really linger on the screen all that long, but I thought it was really effective.
Because even so, Katie's initially very dismissive of the fact that Benji's even there in the first place before realizing, oh, Benji actually might know Vincent now more than Katie does at this point.
No doubt.
So like it's possible that Vincent saw Benji as sort of another son of sorts. Perhaps Benji's been there for quite a few years now, and it seems to establish that that was the case. So sometimes
and
it just
got to
goes
say
to show
his goodbye. Like I love that he got that moment.
yeah, sometimes you just don't know your own family. That's a possible thing.
Absolutely. Any final thoughts you have here on his three daughters?
I like this movie. Azazel Jacobs has done 3 feature films, if I'm not mistaken. I haven't seen French Exit. But I have seen The Lovers.
Yeah, The Lovers I really like. There
Yeah.
was Terry in 2011.
Oh yeah, Terry with John C. Reilly. I forgot
John
about
C.
that.
Reilly. I have not seen that one. That is
Neither
a
have I.
blind spot for me.
Yeah, so there's still more homework I need to do as far as Jacobs' filmography is concerned. I will say between the 2 I have seen, I do still slightly prefer The Lovers over his 3 daughters. And I think primarily it's because I love Tracy Letts in that movie so much. That kind of heightens it a little bit for me.
Yeah.
But there is maybe a little bit more universality that his 3 daughters is dealing with. Perhaps it makes it a more rewatchable experience, even if it's not the most pleasant of viewings. But there's definitely more relatability happening here. I think it's a good movie. Certainly going to be in the conversation when it comes to some of the better performances of the year. Natasha Lyonne specifically, I think, will be in the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I do think this is pretty easily my favorite Jacobs film to this point. I also do like The Lovers. Tracy Letts is wonderful. I do love him in that film. I don't fully love The Lovers. I think there's some interesting things about it. I do think narratively there are aspects to the film that I don't love, but it is a much better film than French Exit, which I don't really like all that much. So of the 3 that I've seen, his 3 daughters is quite easily my favorite.
I feel like that's mostly the consensus based on the critic reviews that I've been seeing for this one.
Yeah, I really like it a lot. And I don't know, there's something about the simplicity of it. We rarely leave the house. And when we do, it's simply to go outside to the park to watch Rachel smoke a joint.
Yeah.
And talk to the security guy.
And it's not necessarily the most complex film, thematically speaking, even if it is dealing with complex emotions. It is kind of slight in that regard, but that's not a bad thing. It's sometimes things need to be a bit on the nose in order to convey the right things, especially when it comes to family dynamics. We need to learn these lessons ultimately.
I mean, I think there is great complexity here as it relates to, again, grief and this lingering inevitability, how that breaks down walls in people, how it's this very distinct, specific moment in time that forces us to wrestle with these introspective thoughts that, again, you don't otherwise have. I think a lot of that comes through organically in the dialogue. And I did find that pretty exquisite here. I do think there's great texture to the film in that regard. So as it relates to death and taking care of our parents and having to grapple with these moments, I think there's something really poignant about that in this film. And I think the execution of it is quite arresting at times. The staginess of it is hard to escape. I think that is easily my biggest criticism of it. It's nothing that completely distracts me from the film. It's just something that
it's not as bad
have
as Fences.
to settle into. Yeah, it's not nearly as bad as Fences. I completely agree. I do think eventually, because of the performances, because of the dialogue, and again, how it gets into grappling with death, there's so much fervent seamlessness with those things here that ultimately the movie simply becomes an experience you can easily kind of tap into.
Yeah.
And
Sure.
I really liked it a lot.
Sure.
Okay. Well, with that, if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here, you can leave a comment below. If you're watching on YouTube, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, reach out to us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd. You can email us insessionfilm@gmail.com. All right. As we wind down here, just a reminder, we have a review for The Substance out. We had a great guest on for that review. Matt Minton joined us for that.
Yeah.
We also have a review for Transformers 1. We have episode 603, where we talked about our top 10 non-Disney, non-Pixar, non-Ghibli animated films of the 21st century. That was a ton of fun. So you can go and check that out. We'll have a new Women in Session and Chasing the Gold tomorrow. We're doubling up on the women shows this week.
Yeah, we are.
So busy week.
Busy
Be sure
week.
to check all
Lots
of
to
that
talk
out.
about.
Brendan, any final thoughts before we get out of here?
Just interesting to think Natasha Lyonne, the first thing I ever saw her in was American Pie. And look how far she's come.
Sure. Yeah. It really is interesting. Like I've seen so much talk about Carrie Coon and her commanding performance here, and she is really good in the film. I mean, it is great to see how she is able to exhibit that rigidness in the character. But there is something about those complexities in Rachel that I loved more. Like I think it's a trickier performance, and I think Leon.
It is a trickier performance. Yeah, I'm with you. And there's also the surprise factor of it too. And this is not to knock Carrie Coon and her performance here.
No,
but this is very much in keeping with what Carrie Coon can do, what we can know that she can do. This is a very out of left field performance for Natasha Lyonne based on what her career has mostly been up until this point. She has given great performances before, but this is different territory for her. So the surprise element, I think, certainly helps too.
I completely agree. Maybe contender for best surprise performance of the year at the In-Session Film Awards?
I mean,
perhaps?
At this point, there's a lot more we need to see, so I don't think it's too hyperbolic to say it's certainly in the conversation for best supporting actress performance of the year.
It could be up there for that too.
Yeah.
Honestly, yeah.
Yeah.
I wasn't trying to get too ahead of myself, but yeah. No, you're definitely right about that for sure. But incredibly standout worthy performance here. I would argue anyway.
Yeah.
So. All right. With all of that said, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for bearing with us this week. I know it was a lot, but I hope you all enjoyed everything that we had to say. It was a great time.
Yeah.
We have Megalopolis and The Wild Robot this weekend. So the fall season, man, it is a full gear
keep us busy.
already.
It's going to keep us busy.
Absolutely. It's going to be fun. All right, stay tuned for all of that. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time on the In-Session Film Podcast. Oh, his 3 daughters. Brendan's 3 daughters. Good stuff.
Thank you, Maury. Thank you.